For 30 years, the gorilla had been unable to have a baby. Now her belly was enormous, but veterinarians were certain she was dying. What they found during surgery changed everything. Before you watch, remember to like and subscribe so you don't miss another touching story like this one. And write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. David Chen's hand shook as he pressed them against the observation glass. Nala hadn't moved in 3 hours. She lay on her side in the corner of her enclosure, her enormous belly rising and falling with labored breaths. Even from here, he could hear the wet rattle in her lungs. She was dying. David. Dr. Sarah Martinez's voice was gentle behind him. We got the scan results. David closed his eyes. He already knew what she was going to say. It's a tumor, malignant, almost certainly, given her age. 42, David whispered. The blood tests had shown elevated levels that we misinterpreted as inflammatory, markers of a spreading disease. In a gorilla of her age, a miracle looks a lot like a catastrophe on a lab report. Given her age, Sarah continued, and the rate of growth, we're looking at weeks, maybe a month. We should talk about euthanasia before the pain becomes unbearable. David's vision blurred with tears. 30 years he'd known Nala, since she arrived as a traumatized infant refusing to eat. He'd slept beside her enclosure for weeks so she wouldn't be alone. He'd taught her to trust again, and watched her become the gentlest soul he'd ever known. But the one thing Nala wanted most had been denied to her. Year after year, nothing. Other females had babies. 8 healthy infants born to the sanctuary silverback. But never to Nala. Infertile, the specialists had concluded. She'll never conceive. And now, after 30 years of empty arms and quiet heartbreak, her body had finally given up. How long does she have? David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Without intervention, maybe 2 months. With euthanasia, we can spare her the suffering. David finally turned to look at Sarah. Can I have some time with her, before we decide? Sarah nodded. Of course. Take all the time you need. That evening, David entered Nala's enclosure with a basket of her favorite treats. Grapes, mango, sweet potato. She didn't even look up. Come on, girl, David said softly, kneeling a few feet away. I know you don't feel good, but you need to eat something. Nala's eyes opened slowly. When she saw David, something shifted in her expression. She made a soft vocalization, the same sound she'd made as a baby when she wanted to be held. David's throat tightened. I'm here, he said, moving closer. I'm right here. Nala reached out one massive hand and touched David's face. Gently. The way she'd done 1,000 times over 3 decades. David covered her hand with his own, tears streaming down his face. I'm not ready to say goodbye to you, he whispered. I don't know how. Over the next week, David spent every spare moment researching. Tumors in elderly gorillas, treatment options, survival rates. Everything pointed to the same grim conclusion. But late one night, exhausted and desperate, David found himself reading about gorilla pregnancies instead. He didn't know why. Maybe he just needed to imagine a world where Nala had gotten what she'd always wanted. One article caught his attention. Dietary changes in pregnant western lowland gorillas. Pregnant females craved specific foods, hibiscus flowers, certain tree bark, foods high in calcium and iron. David sat back in his chair staring at the screen. It was insane. Nala wasn't pregnant. She was dying. But the next morning he brought hibiscus flowers to her enclosure anyway. He scattered them near where she lay, not expecting anything. Nala's nostrils flared. She lifted her head, and then she moved, faster than she'd moved in weeks, and began devouring the flowers. David's heart stopped. Sarah, he shouted into his radio. Sarah, come to Nala's enclosure, now. 20 minutes later, Sarah stood beside David, watching through the glass as Nala finished the last of the hibiscus flowers and reached for more. "That's a pregnancy craving," David said, his voice shaking. "That's not tumor behavior, that's—" "That's impossible," Sarah interrupted. "David, she's 42 years old. She's been barren for 30 years. You can't—" "Do another scan," David said firmly. "Please, just check." Sarah looked at David's face and sighed. "Okay, but David, please don't get your hopes up." The scan was scheduled for the following morning. David didn't sleep. He paced outside Nala's enclosure all night, watching her rest more peacefully than she had in weeks. When the mobile ultrasound unit arrived, it took 3 keepers to convince Nala to position herself for the scan. She was protective of her belly, now guarding it. Sarah applied the gel and positioned the transducer, her eyes on the screen. "I'm just going to confirm the size and location of the mass," she said, moving the probe across Nala's swollen abdomen. David held his breath. Sarah went completely still. "What?" David asked. "What is it?" Sarah's hand was shaking slightly as she adjusted the probe position. "I need you to be very quiet for a moment," she whispered. She moved the probe again, stared at the screen, moved it once more. Then she turned to David, her face white. "There's a heartbeat." The room went silent. "What?" David breathed. "There's a fetal heartbeat." Sarah's voice was barely audible. "David, she's pregnant." David's legs gave out. He sat down hard on the ground, unable to process what he'd just heard. "That's impossible," someone whispered. "I know," Sarah said, still staring at the screen. "But there it is. Approximately 8 months gestation based on size." She turned to David, tears in her eyes. "After 30 years, Nala's finally pregnant." The next 2 weeks were a whirlwind of preparation and mounting concern. Yes, Nala was pregnant. But at her age, the pregnancy itself was life-threatening. Her body wasn't built to handle this anymore, Sarah explained during a staff meeting. "The birth will be extremely high risk, for both her and the baby." "What are our options?" David asked. "We monitor closely, prepare for emergency intervention if needed, and hope for the best." But 3 weeks later, the best started to look less and less likely. Nala went into labor on a Tuesday morning. David was there within minutes of the call, rushing to her enclosure to find her pacing, vocalizing, clearly in distress. "Labor started about 40 minutes ago," one of the keepers reported. "Contractions are strong but irregular." Sarah arrived and immediately began monitoring Nala's vitals. Heart rate elevated but stable. "She's doing okay so far." 2 hours passed. Then 4. Nala was exhausted, her breathing ragged, but the baby hadn't crowned. "Something's wrong," Sarah said quietly. "She should have delivered by now." She did a quick exam and her face went pale. "The baby's stuck. Shoulder dystocia. The shoulders are caught on the pelvic bone." "What does that mean?" David asked, though he could see the answer in Sarah's expression. "It means if we can't get the baby out soon, it will suffocate. But at Nala's age, if we perform a C-section, the trauma will almost certainly kill her. And if we wait, the baby dies, and probably Nala too, from exhaustion and stress." David's mind raced. He'd read about shoulder dystocia. The baby's shoulders caught on the mother's pelvis during delivery. In humans, doctors could sometimes manually reposition the infant, but Nala was a 350-pound gorilla, and she was 42 years old. Her body had already been pushed beyond its limits. "How long does the baby have?" David asked, his voice hollow. Sarah checked her watch. "Minutes, maybe 10 at most, before oxygen deprivation causes brain damage or death." "And the C-section?" "At her age, with her heart already stressed from labor?" Sarah shook her head. "The anesthesia alone could kill her. The blood loss, the trauma to her organs. David, I've never seen a gorilla her age survive a C-section. Ever. So we're choosing," David said quietly, the baby or Nala. That's not, Sarah started. That's exactly what it is, David interrupted. If we wait, try to let nature take its course, the baby dies and probably Nayla too. If we do the surgery, we might save the baby, but we definitely lose Nayla. He looked through the glass at Nala. She was lying on her side now, too tired to stand, her hand resting on her belly. She looked at David, made that soft vocalization again, the sound she made when she was scared, when she needed him. David's vision blurred with tears. 30 years she'd waited. 30 years of watching other mothers hold their babies while her arms stayed empty. And now, when she'd finally, impossibly gotten her miracle, it was going to kill her. Unless. Do the C-section, David said. Sarah stared at him. David, she won't survive it. Maybe not, David said, his voice breaking. But if we do nothing, she definitely dies. At least this way. At least she meets her baby, even if it's just for a moment. David pressed his forehead against the cold operating room glass, his breath fogging the view of the only family he had known for 30 years, silently begging her not to leave him alone in a world without her gentle spirit. She's been waiting 30 years for this, David said firmly. If she's going to die, let her die as a mother, not still waiting. Sarah looked at Nala, then back at David. Okay, she whispered, we'll do the surgery. The next hour was the longest of David's life. The surgical team worked quickly, setting up the mobile surgical suite, preparing anesthesia, sterilizing instruments. Nala was sedated and positioned on her side. David stood just outside the surgical area, close enough to see everything, unable to look away. Sarah made the first incision. Vitals dropping, a technician called out. Keep going, Sarah said, her voice steady despite her shaking hands. Another incision, through muscle, through the uterine wall. I see the baby, Sarah said, suction ready. She reached in and carefully lifted out a tiny form. A baby gorilla, female, impossibly small, silent. Come on, Sarah whispered, clearing the infant's airways. Come on, little one. She rubbed the baby's chest. Once, twice. The baby gasped, and then cried, a weak, mewling sound, but alive. She's breathing, Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. She's alive. But then, another voice. We're losing Nala, heart rate crashing. David's own heart stopped. Nayla, he shouted. Sarah was already working, hands moving rapidly to close the incision, but Nala's vitals were plummeting. No pulse, someone said. She's coding. Start compressions, Sarah ordered. The team worked frantically, but David could see it in their faces. She was gone. Nala had held on just long enough to deliver her baby, and then her heart had stopped. The monitor showed a flat, haunting line, a cruel mechanical scream that filled the room, signaling the end of an era for the sanctuary and the heartbeat of David's life. David was crying openly now, barely able to see through his tears. 30 years. She'd waited 30 years, and she'd gotten 5 minutes. Time of death, Sarah started. Wait, David said. He walked to the surgical table, where the tiny baby gorilla lay wrapped in towels, crying softly. He picked her up, so small, so fragile, and he placed her on Nala's chest. I'm sorry, he whispered to Nala's still form. I'm so sorry, but I wanted you to hold her just once. The baby nuzzled against Nala's fur, her tiny hands gripping instinctively. She made a sound. A cry of distress, searching for her mother. And then the impossible happened. Nala's chest rose, a single gasping breath. Wait, Sarah said. Did she just... Nala's eyes opened. Slowly, confused, exhausted, but open. Her gaze moved down to the tiny form on her chest, and her hand, her massive, gentle hand, moved to cup the baby against her. Oh my God, someone whispered. Sarah checked the monitor. She has a pulse. She's breathing. David was sobbing. watching as Nala pulled her baby closer, protective even in her weakened state. The baby's cry triggered something, Sarah breathed. Somehow love was stronger than death, David finished. Over the next 3 months, Nala recovered slowly. She was too weak to nurse at first, so David bottle-fed the baby, who they'd named Hope, while Nala watched from her nest, her eyes never leaving her daughter. And on a quiet morning in her 12th week, Nala was finally strong enough to hold Hope in her arms and nurse her herself. David watched as Nala examined every tiny finger, every feature of Hope's face. 30 years she'd waited, and when the moment finally came, she'd fought death itself to stay a mother. Did you enjoy this story? Do you believe a mother's love in animals is just as strong as in humans? Yes or no? Let us know what you think in the comments below. Let us know in the comments below. If you like the story, subscribe to this channel and leave a like. Thanks so much for listening. See you in the next video. Have a great day.